Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
It was getting dark in winter. Dark shapes moved in the room, while the red light flickered nicely between the old fireplace tools. An old lady, whose hair had turned silver with time, but her heart remained young, sat thinking in a big chair by the warm fire. Suddenly, the door opened, and a little girl rushed to her. "Hey, Bessie," said the old lady, putting her hand gently on the child's sunny hair. "Did you have fun sliding?" "Yes, Aunt Ruth, and now, can you tell me one of your nice stories?" Bessie was the only child, and her mother had just died. She came to visit her aunt, who had grown to love her a lot because she was sweet and loving. But Aunt Ruth noticed something about Bessie. She didn't always tell the truth, and she didn't seem to feel bad when caught lying. Aunt Ruth was known for always telling the truth, and she didn't like lies at all. It bothered her more than anything else. "I don't want a liar around me," Aunt Ruth thought in her heart. She decided, with God's help, to remove lying from her darling's character, no matter how hard it might be. She had been thinking about this, and now she was determined. "Come sit in your rocking chair, dear, and come close to me," she said, and the child looked up at her with big blue eyes. "I'm old now, Bessie," she said softly, stroking the child's forehead, "and my memory isn't as good as it used to be. But I remember when I was a little girl like you. You look surprised, but one day, if you live long enough, you'll be an old lady like me. When I was young, I was in a spelling class at school with a girl named Amy. She was kind and smart. She liked being my friend, and I liked her too. But sometimes I felt jealous because she did better than me in class, even though I could have been at the top if it wasn't for her. Amy didn't understand why I sometimes acted cold towards her. I was too proud to tell her why. I used to try to make the other girls not like Amy, and that's when I started lying. Amy was too shy to defend herself, so I usually got my way. One day, our teacher gave us the word believe. Amy spelled it B-L-I-E-V. The teacher thought she was wrong and asked, "Didn't you spell it L-E-I-V?" Amy said, "No, ma'am, I spelled it L-I-E-V." The teacher wasn't sure, so she asked me, "Did you hear, Ruth? How did Amy spell it?" A bad idea came to me. I wanted to make Amy look bad and make myself look better. So I lied and said, "Amy spelled it L-E-I-V." The teacher looked at Amy, who was silent and upset by my lie. She looked like she was guilty, with her red face and tears. "Amy," said the teacher sternly, "I didn't expect you to lie. Go to the back of the class and stay after school." I won, Bessie. Amy was in trouble, and I was at the top of the class. But I wasn't happy. After school, I pretended I lost something and stayed in the hallway. I heard the teacher calling Amy. Amy said, "Miss R, I didn't lie," but I could see through the keyhole that she was trembling with fear and sadness. "Put out your hand." I stood there, frozen. I heard the teacher hitting Amy's small hand over and over with a stick. It hurt me to hear it, but I didn't confess. Instead, I quietly left. I saw Amy walking slowly, wiping her tears with one hand and holding her books with the other. Her crying made me sad. She stumbled and dropped her books. I picked them up and gave them to her. She looked at me with teary eyes and said, "Thank you, Ruth." It made me feel even guiltier, but I didn't say anything. We walked home together without talking. When I got home, I tried to pretend everything was fine, but I felt worse inside. I didn't need anyone to tell me I did wrong. I felt like God was judging me. I tried to act happy, but tears were hiding behind my smiles. I went to my room. I couldn't pray, so I hurried to bed and closed my eyes. But I couldn't sleep. The ticking of the old clock got louder, like it was scolding me. When it struck midnight, it sounded like a scary bell. I tossed and turned on my pillow, feeling like it was full of thorns. I kept thinking of Amy's sad eyes and the sound of the teacher's stick hitting her hand. I couldn't take it anymore, so I got up and sat by the window. The trees outside looked peaceful in the moonlight, but I felt restless. Everything around me seemed to remind me of my guilt. The quietness of the night made me feel even worse. I felt like God was mad at me, and my conscience was heavy with guilt. I looked at my white bedsheet, a gift from my mom. I remembered her kindness and her last wish for me to be truthful and good. I tried to ignore it, but her words echoed in my mind, making me cry even harder. But crying didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't bear it anymore, so I ran to my dad's room in terror. "Dad! Dad!" I cried, but I couldn't say anything else. He gently held me close, calming me down until I could explain why I was so upset. Then he prayed earnestly to God, asking for forgiveness for his sinful child. "Dear Dad," I said, "can we go see Amy tonight?" He said, "Tomorrow morning, my child." Waiting felt like torture, but I tried to hide my disappointment. I accepted my dad's kiss and went back to my room, but I still couldn't sleep. I desperately wanted to ask Amy for forgiveness. I waited for morning, but it felt like hours. My pain became unbearable, so I went back to my dad, crying. I begged him to go with me to see Amy right away, whispering, "She might die before she forgives me." He touched my hot cheek and after thinking for a moment, he said, "I'll go with you, my child." We quickly set off. When we reached Mrs. Sinclair's house, we saw lights moving around inside. I felt scared and clung to my dad. He quietly opened the gate, and we went in without a word. The doctor, who was leaving, looked surprised to see us there so late. I felt a wave of fear as my dad asked about Amy. The doctor told us she had brain fever. He said, "Her mom told me she hasn't been feeling well for a few days, but she didn't want to miss school. She came home yesterday afternoon, acting very differently. She didn't eat dinner and just sat at the table quietly, looking really sad. Her mom tried everything to find out why she was so upset, but couldn't. She went to bed still looking heartbroken, and less than an hour later, I was called. She's been calling for her dear Ruth in her delirium, begging for your help, the doctor explained. Bessie, I can't tell you how much those words hurt me. I begged Amy's mom to let me see her for just a moment. She kindly took my hand, the hand of the one who caused all this pain, and led me to Amy's room. As I looked at her, all hope vanished. She already looked like she was dying. I knelt by her bed and whispered, begging for forgiveness with all my heart. But when I looked at her, she didn't recognize me in her confused state. No, Bessie, I knew I would never be comforted by her forgiveness. The next time I saw Amy, she was sleeping. The redness in her cheeks had disappeared, and her face looked pale, with her long eyelashes casting a shadow. She wasn't confused anymore, and her heart had stopped hurting. Her small, white hand, which once trembled as it received punishment, now rested peacefully. There would be no more tears or sadness for her. She had passed away. My grief was overwhelming, maybe even worse than Amy's mother's, whom I had hurt so much. She forgave me, but I couldn't forgive myself. The winter that followed felt endless. I got sick with a fever, and in my delirium, I kept calling out for Amy. But my dear father's prayers were answered by God, and I recovered from the illness. When spring arrived and flowers began to bloom around Amy's grave, I was allowed to visit for the first time. I felt dizzy as I read the words carefully engraved on the white tombstone. Amy Sinclair passed away on September 3rd. I knelt beside her grave and prayed with faith. It brought me relief and strength, Bessie, Aunt Ruth said, gently touching Bessie's head as she bowed down in sorrow. Bessie's tears had been flowing for a while, and now her sadness seemed overwhelming. Aunt Ruth didn't try to comfort her, hoping that her sorrow would bring healing. Please pray for me, whispered Bessie, finally looking up through her tears and hugging her aunt tightly. From her heart, Aunt Ruth prayed for the crying child. Bessie would never forget that moment. In that twilight hour, a light of understanding dawned on her, brighter than the morning sun. And though Aunt Ruth had to bring up painful memories from the past, she felt more than repaid for her sacrifice. Because in that clear light of truth, Bessie's once troubled face, as lovely as a May morning, now shone with a newfound purpose of honesty and goodness.